So, good afternoon. Thanks for being here. It is my pleasure to welcome and introduce you to Professor Jennifer Frey, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina. Professor Frey obtained her doctorate from the renowned philosophy department at the University of Pittsburgh.
What they call the life satisfaction view. So this is a kind of judgment that you are satisfied with how your life has gone or is going on the whole. Each one of these views assumes that happiness is good and that a good life is at least in part a happy life, such that happiness
is a legitimate goal, both for you as a guide to your choices and your behavior, but also for public policy. Now, each of these views deserves a talk in its own right, and I cannot and I will not do justice to any of them now. For now, I want to note two fatal flaws that I think each suffers. The first is a too narrow focus on the individual as an isolated unit of assessment. And the second is a kind of dualism or divorce between the psychological perspective of that individual and objective facts about the human person and human goodness. I think these two problems are related. So fundamentally, I would argue, human beings are rational, linguistic, political, social, and interdependent creatures. Given that that's the kind of thing that we are, our happiness has to be understood in terms of common goods and shared forms of life. So a theory that understands happiness as subjectivism does in terms of an individual's psychology alone necessarily misses the reality of the human person, and therefore cannot be understood as a theory of human happiness in the sense of a good that really ought to be pursued in life, let alone the ultimate good or pursued in human life. This is not to deny the obvious, that is, that happiness does have a robust subjective component to it. It would obviously be strange if the first-person experience of the happy human life were deeply unpleasant or even downright miserable. That would make it an open question whether happiness was really worth pursuing, and it would completely divorce a philosophical concept of happiness from our everyday use of the term. Those both seem like really big problems. So any theory of happiness must demonstrate why everybody wants it, why we consider it the goal. So the concern isn't really whether there is a subjective side to happiness, there obviously is, but whether the subjective side of happiness exhausts the concept. Subjectivists of all stripes and levels of sophistication say, yes, that it does. Now, I find the purely subjective psychological concept of happiness shallow. It leaves us unable to say why the pursuit of happiness is a truly excellent pursuit, since a wicked or a superficial person might experience a great deal of pleasure or a preponderance of positive over negative emotional affect, and we can easily imagine that such people might feel pretty satisfied with their lives on the whole, even though they should not. We can call such people happy, but we'd thereby be draining the word of its ethical import. So I would like to suggest that when we talk about the human pursuit of happiness, we're not simply interested in being in a certain psychological condition. If that were all that fundamentally mattered, then we could just as easily manipulate ourselves into this condition through medical interventions, say, or by getting plugged into a virtual happiness world, as opposed to living in a certain way. But typically, when we think of happiness, we're thinking of happy lives, that is, a certain way of living and being, and not simply having a certain kind of experience. So if happiness cannot be the product of manipulation and remain genuinely choice-worthy, it has to be something achieved by the human person through the self-determined exercise of her own capacities. It has to be a goal of human agency. So happiness, I think, is properly understood as the fullest actualization or expression of human agency. The problem with subjectivism is its narrow focus on a positive subjective outcome and the lack of concern for how one achieved that outcome, and also the objective circumstances in which this outcome is situated. But looking at how you arrived, and looking outside the confines of the subjective self, opens up space for reflection about whether the condition itself is legitimate. That is to say, whether you could reasonably choose to get there via the path you took. And the only way to do this, I think, is to acknowledge that happiness, as the moral philosopher Philippa Foot insists in her book, Natural Goodness, is that happiness must be conceptually linked with human good. So this is also a quote on your handout. This is from Natural Goodness. Philippa writes, "We're tempted to think of deep happiness as explicable psychologically in a way that makes it possible to separate it from its objects. But why should this be possible? Why shouldn't the community of meaning not depend here on a shared reaction among human beings to certain things that are very general in human life? Are not these reactions shared even by people of very different cultures? Not, of course, exactly, but nevertheless, with sufficient similarity for people of one age or culture to understand the depth of happiness over a birth and the depth of grief over the death of a parent, child, or friend." So Foot clearly wants an account of deep happiness as something grounded in human nature that transcends cultures and the limitations of one's historical context. But how can we arrive at such an account? Foot's suggestion is to make morality about living well, or about flourishing human lives. This makes her unique amongst contemporary philosophers. The majority of contemporary analytic moral philosophers take the question of happiness to be off topic. They concern themselves with concepts of obligations, duties, reasons, rights, or normativity generally, actually serious stuff. I want to suggest that this is a mistake and that the goal of the moral life, or what I want to suggest is the same, the human life, is happiness properly understood. And I believe that subjectivism about happiness is an obstacle to recovering this point of view. And for that reason, I would like it to go away. Okay, one reason to turn to Aquinas is that he gives us a theory that is not dualist in any of the familiar senses. So there is, on Aquinas' view, no divorce between the subjective and the objective. That is to say, the positive psychological affect and objective value aspects of happiness. And there is no divorce between nature, that is to say, what we are, and value, what is good for us. And I think it's these problematic dualistic tendencies that prevent us from articulating an ethic of happiness. And I think that Aquinas gives us a framework for overcoming them. So for Aquinas, happiness is about perfection. In particular, the perfected activity of the rational capacities we have to know the truth and love the good. Happiness, or beatitude, is the word for perfect human fulfillment, which comes by way of perfect possession of the good for a human person, or perfect realization of human potential. As perfect fulfillment, it is psychologically real. The desires of the perfectly happy person are fully satisfied. As perfect realization, it is the possession of what is objectively good for the human person. Now, for Aquinas, happiness is the highest good, which is his name for the final goal or purpose of human life. By final, he follows Aristotle in meaning most complete. So it's that which, if one comes to possess it, there is nothing left for one to seek after or to long for. One searches for the good when he's lacking something, but a perfectly happy person lacks nothing. There is nothing higher, nothing left over once perfect happiness is attained, precisely because it is complete human actualization and fulfillment. Anything short of this goal, of this perfect happiness, Aquinas thinks will leave the human heart restless and searching. That is to say, still to some extent dissatisfied. Okay, so So that's the general picture. I want to step back and look at how Aquinas approaches happiness within the context of the Summa. So it helps to consider where his discussion of happiness occurs in the Summa. It comes after he has considered life generally, and he's considering life within the theological context of God's eternal life. And then he considers plant, animal, and human life specifically. Aquinas first gives us an account of life. Living things for Aquinas are self-movers. Then he gives us an account of the human person and the principal powers of the human soul through which a human person moves himself. And then Aquinas gives us an account of happiness. Why does he proceed in that way? The answer, I think, is that Aquinas believes that happiness has to do with human fulfillment, or the fulfillment of our nature. And he thinks that these concepts like flourishing and nature fulfillment, apply to all living things, and that human fulfillment or flourishing is a piece of a much larger account of what it is for a thing to live well as the kind of thing that it is. So for him, the concept of life and life activity is front and center in his account of happiness and morality. And it's important to me because it's central to understanding the way in which Aquinas is able to bring the subjective and the objective aspects of happiness into a single unified theory. So in order to make progress here, I just need to say some really basic things about Aquinas's metaphysics, and they're really basic, and I'm not going to get into details, but just to give you a picture, probably most of you already know this, but Aquinas gives priority to substances as the primary sense of being, and he takes the paradigmatic case of substances to be living things. So individual substances that share a common form or nature with other members of their kind, right? So you're all beautiful individual persons, but you're all the same insofar as you share a common human nature. We're all human beings. So a human being is a substance and a living thing. It's a natural per se unity. A per se unity is, for Aquinas, an agent's act. An agent's act in characteristic ways. Aquinas also calls living things self-movers because they determine themselves to their own acts. Now, Aquinas thinks that in order to make sense of the concept of self-motion, we have to have some conception of a unified subject that directs its various capacities to a single end, the realization of its own kind of being, its form of life. So for a self-mover, all of its movements are ordered as parts or phases of its other movements, and all of this is for the sake of realizing form. So Aquinas appeals to a special form of explanation for agents. I just call it natural teleological explanation. It's on your handout. The movement of any part of a living thing is explained by reference to the movement of the whole thing towards a single internal unitary end, nature, life form. That's just the form of explanation. Now, Aquinas explains vital movements in terms of capacities or powers or abilities, pick your favorite term there, for certain ends that define and measure the activity. So on this view, each power is its own internal principle of movement and rest, but all powers are ultimately ordered to the realization of form. And the perfection of a power is its complete actualization. So a power is fully actualized when it reaches the end towards which it's naturally ordained. So on this account, right, this kind of metaphysics of substance, knowledge of what a thing is at the same time knowledge of its good, of its perfected activity or fulfillment. You can call this a kind of metaphysical naturalism. To have being on this view is to have some measure of actuality or reality. So every act of a capacity implies some sort of perfection because every act is ordered to an end that both defines the act as the sort of act it is, and in so defining it, provides a measure, right? A standard of success or failure. And when we talk about being or reality or actuality, that's the way Aquinas is thinking about it. When we talk about the good, what good adds to being, in Thomas's view, is the desirability of attaining the condition of complete actualization of the potential inherent to a thing. So it's desirable for an oak tree to attain its mature stage of existence or its perfection, because anything short of that is an imperfect or incomplete condition for it. So when you think about perfection, you're thinking about a condition of lacking nothing that ought to pertain to a thing according to its nature. So it's some idea of living well in the fullest, most complete sense. So full actualization, full realization of potential, something like this. Okay, so this is the framework for thinking about happiness. Now, when we talk about happiness, we've already left behind plant and animal life for Aquinas, because happiness is the perfected activity of a thing with rational capacities, capacity of intellect and will. Rational animals have a self-conscious form of life, so they determine themselves to act in a more perfect way, that is to say, in light of their knowledge of the good. Intellect is our capacity for general knowledge, our ability to be conformed to reality by possessing the truth, and the will is our capacity to love, our ability to seek after what we know is good and to come to possess it for ourselves. That's how Thomas is understanding rational capacities, and they work in tandem. So Aquinas thinks that human action, properly so called, has its source in intellect and will. These are the activities and actions over which we exercise what he calls dominium, or just rational control. So in the treatise on human acts, he says, man is the master of his acts through reason and will. For Aquinas, this is the sphere of freedom and responsibility. In fleshing this out, Aquinas argues that happiness is a kind of constitutive principle of human life and action. So it both defines and measures human action, right? A human act is essentially ordered to the goal of human happiness, and that goal measures human action. So it's a good action if it actually contributes to or constitutes happiness, and it's bad if it doesn't. So to speak of the moral life, or to speak of morality or moral action, is just to say that is the stuff from which happiness either is or isn't made. And if you don't like happiness talk, you could just substitute talk of living well, because that's the concept. Happiness is living well. Okay, so if happiness functions as a constitutive principle in the sense that it both defines and measures, then it's not something we choose. It's a natural end. We cannot cease to want to be happy without ceasing to be a human being engaging in human action. In fact, for Aquinas, happiness as a natural end is what makes rational choice possible. Again, this goes back to human action fitting in this broader account of self-motion, and the concept of self-motion implying a unified subject that directs itself through a natural inclination to a single end, the coming to be and maintenance of its own form. Like the unifying end of any other living thing, human happiness both defines and measures human action and human choice by describing that single end at which human action reaches its perfected condition, its final end, its telos, or its perfection. So rational creatures are engaged in the process of determining themselves to act through the use of practical reason and will. In this way, they move themselves to their natural end in a more perfect sense than any other living thing, freely, in accordance with a general conception of their universal good. So when Aquinas discusses the nature of the voluntary is the specific character of human action. He describes the voluntary in terms of a certain kind of knowledge. So this is also on your handout. This is what Aquinas says in the treatise on human acts, the question on the voluntary. It's essential to the voluntary act that its principle be within the agent, together with perfect knowledge of the end. Now, knowledge of the end is twofold, perfect and imperfect. Perfect knowledge of the end consists in not only apprehending the thing which is the end, but also in knowing it under the aspect of the end, the ratio finis, and the means to the end. And such knowledge belongs to none but the rational nature. But imperfect knowledge of the end consists in mere apprehension of the end without knowing it under the aspect of the end or the relationship of an act to the end. So the contrast that he's making here is between rational self-movement, human action, and the action of other animals, which proceeds through a principle of cognition. Animals cognize the world and desire things accordingly, but it's not rational cognition. And so the character of it's fundamentally different in such a way that divorces it from any talk of happiness. Now, there are three important points that I want to make about this passage on the nature of the voluntary. First, voluntary action is very clearly a form of self-motion. The principle of a voluntary action is internal to the agent, which directs it to an end that both defines and measures it. The internal principle of human action is a principle of a specifically practical kind of knowledge. So it's a kind of knowledge that produces what it cognizes. We can talk more about that later, if you want. Second, whereas the movements of plants are in no sense voluntary because plants do not have cognition or desire, animal motion is imperfectly voluntary and proceeds from an imperfect principle of cognition. The difference between animal and human action is a difference in capacities or internal principles by which they move themselves to a natural end. Both move by knowledge and desire, but a rational animal moves by universal or general knowledge and desire. So an animal, because it only cognizes particulars for Aquinas, cannot make choices in light of meaningful alternatives. In order for an animal to be able to transcend its instincts, they'd have to possess intellect and will, which would allow it to perceive and desire goods under different intentional descriptions and also different levels of intentional descriptions, an ability that implies that one possesses some general conception of how to live your life on the whole, a conception that is deployed in choice and provides a measure of choice. So for an animal, it does not have a logos or an account of what it does. That is to say, it does not act for reasons because it has no universal knowledge and seeks no universal good. That would require intellect. So human action is perfectly voluntary because it proceeds from, this perfect knowledge of the end. So for Aquinas, a human not only knows its ends when it acts voluntarily, but knows them and understands them in relation to its other ends, and further understands how these ends are ordered to its conception of how its life ought to be going on the whole. So a human being doesn't merely see what it's after, it sees what it's after in relation to a general rational conception of how to live, a conception of happiness. This sort of general conceptual knowledge is necessary for the action to be voluntary. So I think people get a little confused, or at least sometimes students get confused with this talk about perfect knowledge of the end. It doesn't mean that you have a proper account of the good life, okay? It's a formal claim. It means that you see your particular choice and your particular action in light of something far more general. And the fact that you possess this knowledge is the mark of your rationality. So one way to see how this works is to think about what Elizabeth Anscombe says about human action in her famous book, Intention. So Anscombe says that intentional actions have to be known by their agents in a specifically first personal way. So you can't be acting intentionally unless you know what you're doing under intentional descriptions. And what reveals that you have this practical knowledge of what you do under intentional descriptions is your ability to answer a certain sense of the question, why? So I can ask you, hey, why are you standing at that podium, gesticulating widely and talking about Aquinas? And I can give you a response. And my response is supposed to be intelligible, right? And the intelligibility of my response either wears itself on its face or it relates to other things I'm up to. So if I tell you, well, I'm a philosophy professor, I give philosophy talks. Why do philosophy professors give philosophy talks? I have a story about that. And I have a story that fits in my life in particular, that makes sense of all the other things I'm going on, and it's all sort of brought to bear on what I'm doing right now. Okay. So if you can answer this sort of why question, then you demonstrate not only that you know what you're doing, but you know that for the sake of which you're doing it. So you're able to give an account of how your action fits in the structure of your life. And to possess this ability to act in this kind of general knowledge, that's just what it is to act from practical reason and will or voluntarily. And this conception that you deploy in human action, Aquinas is going to call that a vision of happiness. But he means happiness there in a specifically formal sense. Now, the determination of what happiness consists in is the necessary work of practical reason. It's acquired and revised over time. I don't want to get into his theory of practical reason. He does think that the first principles of practical reason come from nature, so they themselves are not chosen, but they structure what like human beings are after in a general way. But my conception of how to live is something that I've determined through reason over time in accordance with these first principles. But this is formal happiness. Now, Aquinas does not think that a formal conception of happiness has to be all that articulate. It certainly doesn't have to be true for you to act voluntarily. That is to say, in a way that expresses freedom and that makes you responsible for what you do. But you have to have something. You have to have some concrete vision of how to live in order to make choices. And that would be a material conception of happiness. So we all have a formal conception of happiness, but we might have very different material conceptions of happiness. You might think that the happy life is pleasure. You're wrong. That's not going to work out. But we don't. So Aquinas wants to say, look, everybody has to have happiness in the formal sense. The formal sense of happiness, understanding its role in the account of human action and human agency, is going to be deployed to help us argue about what material happiness actually consists in. But everybody has to have some formal vision of happiness. Okay. Formally, Aquinas thinks of happiness in terms of what can completely satisfy our capacity for rational desire, our capacity to will. So happiness in this sense is being fully sated. Being sated has a clear subjective component and is psychologically real. But that kind of satisfaction only comes by way of possessing what is truly or objectively good and perfective of human persons. So shallow pleasures and lesser goods are ultimately going to leave you dissatisfied with your own life. And if you look at the arguments in the treatise on happiness, where Aquinas sort of goes through various obvious candidates, right, for the happy life, all the arguments work in exactly the same way. It's not really going to satisfy you given what you are. It's going to fall short. Okay, I'll just say something like really fast about the relationship between happiness and virtue. A virtue is a disposition whereby the subject is well disposed according to the mode of its nature. So virtues are habits. They're habits that perfect our natural human capacities of thought, action, and feeling so that they reliably act in accordance with principles of right practical reason in order to attain and maintain happiness. So that's the connection. Virtue requires knowledge of what living well actually consists in here and now, but also well-ordered appetites. Because virtuous action has to be pleasing to the virtuous person, so she's supposed to do it with ease and pleasure, and you can't do that if your appetites are all disordered. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about virtue. Aquinas' formal account of happiness, like I've been arguing, is deployed as a constitutive principle. Our other capacities become properly human only insofar as we use them to seek our happiness. So Aquinas talks about the principal powers of the soul, and what he means by that is the powers that we exercise in order to reach happiness. So even powers that are not themselves essentially rational capacities, like passions, for example, are susceptible of rational perfection, right? So they can become rationally disposed. This is like, Aquinas argues against the Franciscans about this, the Augustinians. He thinks that our other properly human powers can come under the full control of reason, but that just means that they come to be disposed in such a way as to actually order us towards happiness. Okay. The only other point I want to make here, maybe this is obvious, but it's worth stating again. For Aquinas, there's an obvious subjective side to happiness, but it's grounded in the objective reality of the human person, which has a very clear and definite priority. So what is fundamental to his account of happiness isn't subjective affect, but perfected life activity. And perfected life activity will in fact be pleasing to the person who is well disposed to engage in it, that is to say, the virtuous person. And the sign of this is that the activity longs to sustain itself in being without cessation or interruption. Of course, perfected activity cannot sustain itself in this life, which is why Aquinas also insists that perfect happiness, where that means complete uninterrupted possession of a good that cannot be lost, cannot be had in this life. But the imperfect happiness of this life is still really great. So I don't want to denigrate it. But for Aquinas, it's something like a foretaste or a foreshadowing of something more permanent and eternal, which would be our perfect happiness. And I think that a secular friend of Aquinas at this point would sort of like jump off the train and just say, imperfect happiness is all we have. Thankfully, it's still pretty great, but you can lose it, right? We're finite, vulnerable creatures. But in every other respect, I think they could take on board Aquinas' view. They would just have to drop the commitment to perfect happiness. Okay, so I promise I'm getting really close to being done. There's one final point about happiness that I want to underscore because it is so much neglected in the analytic tradition in which I work. And that is that for Aquinas, as for Aristotle, happiness is a common good. For our purposes, there are 3 points to make about a common good. First, it is a good that is common to all human beings in virtue of their nature. So that's the first sense of common. Second, a common good is not competitive, which means that no individual's happiness should in principle detract from anyone else's. Third, a common good is never the sole possession of an individual, because the enjoyment of common goods only comes through activities in which others also participate, such that the good is truly enjoyed in common between them. In fact, the pleasure of the activity is intensified when participated in common with others. So just to give an example, the characteristic joy of playing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony well could never be solely identified with a single French horn player. Such a joy cannot be attained alone by him, but only with the other members of the orchestra and the chorus together. And the joy of playing the instruments is intensified and shared when it's in common with others to produce the symphony. Okay, now that's, I think the claim, I'm not sure about this, actually, I'd be interested in what you think, but I think the claim that happiness is a common good is probably something that has to be argued at the level of the material conception of happiness as opposed to a formal conception. But if happiness is a common, that is universal, non-competitive, and shared or participatory sort of good, and the virtues dispose us to possess it, then the cultivation of virtue involves coming to see ourselves as happy together rather than as isolated individuals. So the habituation of virtues, the cultivation of virtues then, is a matter of coming to see ourselves as parts of a greater whole. This is the link between virtue and self-transcendence. So once a person recognizes herself as an integral part of a larger whole, she understands the good of the whole as her own good. And the virtues enable us to see that our perfection or happiness is held in common in shared forms of life with others. And again, this is going to go back fundamentally to what we are. For human beings, are social, linguistic, and political animals. So by nature, we are parts related to a larger whole. And Aquinas is very clear about this commitment. So this leads me to talking about, just very briefly, about friendship and the role of friendship in the happy life as Aquinas understands it. In friendship, one takes the good of the friend as an essential part of her own good, such that the friend's happiness becomes an essential part of one's own happiness. The happiness of friends is a quintessential common good in which both friends participate. And friendship necessarily involves a self-transcendent perspective in which one sees one's life and one's good in relation to a greater whole. A friend understands herself as part in the sense of a participant in a union of affection and will with another. Insofar as she takes up this practical perspective, she doesn't see her own happiness as in competition with others. Rather, her own happiness is bound up in intricate ways with the happiness of her friends. If my friend suffers, I suffer. If my friend flourishes, I flourish. In such friendships, we are willing to make sacrifices and suffer for our friends' sake, precisely because we love them, will their good, and see our own good as bound up inextricably with theirs. For example, I can give up many enjoyable ways of spending my free time for a sick child who needs my loving care and attention. I sacrifice in this way for the child, so that the child will benefit because I love the child and I want the child's good. And I do this because I see my own happiness as essentially bound up with the happiness of the child. So I'm not going to enjoy my morning run if I know that my daughter Kiara is at home crying, needing me. It's just, I'm just not going to have, I might get an endorphin rush, but I'm not going to have the characteristic joy of my morning run. So Aquinas argues that the part does indeed love the good of the whole, not, however, so as to refer the good of the whole to itself, but rather itself to the good of the whole. So a good parent always ultimately prefers the goods of family life, goods that can only be shared in common with the members of the family and not solely by the parent over private goods. A good parent sees her happiness as the happiness of the whole family. She does not see her personal happiness as something in competition with family life. She puts her happiness in family life. So achieve this kind of self-transcendence and love for others. I don't think it's really selflessness or even forgetting the self. I think it involves transcending a more enclosed mode of selfhood for the sake of a higher, more expansive mode of selfhood. In friendship and the cultivation of friendship, which for Aquinas involves virtue, the self becomes enlarged through effective identification with the friend. And in genuine friendships, participants experience both the happiness and unhappiness of the other as their own. And as we grow in virtue, we learn to love in ways that transcend the self and that expand our conception of the self such that the good of others becomes essential to this vision that we all have to operate under, right? So friendship comes to occupy a central aspect of that vision and will determine our choices. And in that way, our conception of happiness becomes properly a common good. The final point, I guess, that I want to make is that to become properly ordered to the common good involves more than having a correct vision of life. It primarily is about loving others and willing the good for them. And that comes by way of coming to find your joy in flourishing together with others rather than in flourishing at someone else's expense. Okay, well, obviously Aquinas doesn't think that human friendship is the highest good. He thinks that human friendship is part of what we would call imperfect happiness. Obviously, Aquinas thinks that we can have more than this. He thinks we can participate in God's eternal life by attaining the beatific vision. This is for him a kind of real communion or friendship. But he also thinks we cannot attain this on our own. We cannot attain it through natural acquired virtue. It takes God's grace. Also, you cannot have it in this life. You have to die to be perfectly happy. But look, maybe I'll just end with a final thought, which will really be where the secular friend of Aquinas and the true Thomist are going to part ways, and that is the question, look, why should you seek perfect happiness? Okay, perfect happiness is a really high bar. Why go after that? And Aquinas' answer is that it's inevitable, okay? That, again, it has to do with what you are. So Aquinas thinks that as rational creatures with rational capacities, we necessarily reach out to infinity. And thus we reach out to God as the only thing that can satisfy our capacity to possess what is truly universally good. Any created good will fall short of satisfying the will as an appetite for the universal good. And this explains, Aquinas thinks, the fundamental restlessness of the human heart that's captured so beautifully in St. Augustine's Confessions, right? As St. Augustine says that our hearts are restless until they rest in you. They're searching for something that's truly going to satisfy, and only union with an infinite God will suffice. Okay, so that's it. Thank you for your attention.
We've got time for some questions and comments. I'll start with Walter and then Thomas.
So it would help me if you could apply this to an example.
Yeah.
And in particular, kind of an everyday example.
Yeah.
You know, I press the button on my iPhone in order to check my email.
Yep.
Now, I take it that involves a movement of a living thing, namely my finger. But I don't see any single unitary end. So I'd like to hear more about what that would be.
Yeah.
And it seems to me I did do it in a voluntary way.
Yeah.
But I don't see perfect knowledge or knowing it under the aspect of the end or any of
Right.
that.
Yeah.
I'm just checking my email.
Right. Yeah.
And I
So.
don't even know what I'm going to find.
Right. Yeah. So I think that one problem that people have when they encounter Aquinas, but also when they encounter Anscombe, is that they think that either one of these thinkers is giving an account of like what's going on in your head when you act, and they're not. What they're trying to give an account of is the way that a particular human action has to ultimately be made intelligible. And so if you think about Anscombe's intention, and she has this idea that intentional acts are those to which one has to have a certain kind of practical knowledge of. It has to be knowledge under intentional descriptions. The way to demonstrate that you possess such knowledge is to be able to answer these why questions. And it's pretty clear that what she's driving at is that this practical knowledge that you have of the intentional descriptions of what you do are things that ultimately fit into a practical syllogism. Now, a practical syllogism isn't a matter of anyone's psychology. It's just showing the practically rational character of what you do. She thinks that for any intentional action, you could make such a syllogism. So to apply it to your example, I press the button on my iPhone to check my email, right? Why are you checking your email? Because I check my email all the time, right? Because it's part of my job, it's part of my life. You know, maybe I'm gonna hear from students, who knows, maybe there's nothing there. But I have this habit of checking my email. Why do you have this habit of checking your email? Well, again, you know, it's a huge part of my life. This is how people contact me. Why do you need to be in contact with people? I mean, you can give an account of what you're up to. Now, are you thinking that when you press your iPhone? No, you're just checking your email. I mean, it's habitual action. Pretty much anything you do with your iPhone is deeply habitual action. You don't have to think about it. But the fact that you don't have to think about it doesn't mean that there isn't a rational structure there. Virtuous action is the same way. Aristotle and Aquinas are really clear that the virtuous person doesn't have to think so much about what they do. But that doesn't mean that their action is thoughtless. Actually, there's like a real account about what they're up to. But for the virtuous person, like they just see it. Right? And they do it, and they don't have to deliberate. Nevertheless, the deliberative structure is there. And so...
Can I ask you real quick, how would you distinguish, taking this example, an action from a movement that's not an action? An impulsive, a dog scratching himself, a guy checking his email. Seems like similar in a way that... thinking about my email as a part of my life, and therefore I'm checking it in order to choose the good.
Well, so there are aspects of human life that are more like the dog scratching, right? And Aquinas addresses this. So when he wants to talk about proper human action, right, he's talking about that over which you have this perfect knowledge. So a thing that I do all the time is like gesticulate with my hands. It's not, this is actually like kind of a vague category because it's not like I think there's anything wrong with it. So it's not like saying like and where I really do try to not say like and fail. I know that I say like and but I really do try to like manipulate myself in various ways so that I don't do it. They're like little exercises you can do. I don't do that with my hands. It's like cool, it's fine. You know, I'm from an Italian family. We just have the hand thing going on. But suppose that like somebody came up to me after a job talk and they were like, I really liked your talk, but your hands drive me crazy and I'm not gonna hire you. Then I would be like, whoa, I need to get those hands under control, you know? And then I would like buy clothes with pockets and like really try to keep my hands in my pockets. And like, you know, I start to try to exercise this control. And Aquinas' basic point is that, look, when you try to exercise rational control over things which you can control, right? Then it becomes voluntary. So it might become the case that what I do with my hands in my talk is like really deliberate. Whereas right now it's kind of just free. And but also Aquinas would say, and this is where it gets complicated, and Anscombe agrees with him, the voluntary is what can come under the command of the will. So that means that, yeah, this might not be deliberate or whatever, but if it turned out that doing this with my hands like really violated social norms, or I don't know, in certain communities this was like an insult or something, and I could have and should have known that doing this with my hand was insulting. Now we're in the area of negligence, right? And so Aquinas would say, if you could have and should have controlled something and you didn't, voluntary. So it gets into like his whole account of negligence and stuff. But again, the ultimate, even his account of negligence is going to go back to this perfect knowledge. Like you should have seen that this little thing you're doing with your hand is really insulting in this context. You know that you shouldn't, right? It conflicts with your job, blah, blah, blah.
Thomas.
So I want to raise a couple of questions, and they in a way build on what you just brought up. So I'm reading right now, it's a perverse thing to do, I suppose, these days, but I'm reading at night for pleasure Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, which is probably
But that's not perverse.
as anatomistic a text as you could possibly come up with.
Oh, I don't know.
It brings to mind a few things. I'm not going to get us talking about Dostoevsky, but it brings up to mind a couple of key features in your talk that I kept feeling uneasy about.
Okay.
So the first thing is that we have in Aquinas two accounts. We have an account of living well that is essentially based on Aristotle's conception of a naturalistic entelechy model of flourishing. And then we have, still within the modality of what you call perfective life activity, we have an eschatological account.
Right.
The question that immediately arises for me is how do the two relate to one another? Is it a question
Yes.
that the naturalistic account is merely incomplete, or does it fundamentally miscarry that mandates supplementing it with an eschatological account? So that's the first question.
Yeah.
Underneath that is the question, when you spoke of the very much Aristotelian, you gave us a very Aristotelian Thomas here, of the principle being internal to the agent. The question arises, yes, but how so? By default or by discernment?
By default.
By default?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's in terms of human agency, that's presumably something of a problem in as much as we are invested with choice, right? So that with the capacity of choosing, so that our relationship to our end is at some point always going to have to be discretionary and elective. We do not have a relationship to our end in the way that an acorn relates to the oak that it will hopefully someday become.
No, of course not.
And so that's why Dostoevsky is interesting, because he shows people perpetually undermining in so many ways. It's a veritable miscarriage of the Aristotelian model, sort of an encyclopedia of all the ways in which human flourishing can miscarry. You find in that great book.
Yes.
So here's my second question then. And this actually goes back to the sort of cell phone example. Having been at a chamber concert this past weekend, I was in the middle of a slow movement, and my neighbor suddenly whips out her phone and starts checking her email. And she could have given a rational account for doing it, and although I might have not accepted it. But it clearly indicated that there's a point where habituation and compulsion seem to bleed over into one.
Yeah, sure.
And so that any rational account she might have then given would seem to be somewhat sort of manufactured as ex post facto, so as to, exculpate.
Okay, so the second one is easier, so I'll take that one first. When Aquinas talks about voluntary action, he means free action, so something that is done from a free choice. And so if your neighbor compulsively checks her iPhone, then it might not be voluntary. So if you're like, why are you checking your iPhone? And she's super embarrassed and ashamed. And it's like, oh, actually I have no reason. I just, I have to have that little, endorphin rush that I get from checking it. Then we're not really talking about free action. Now, how you exactly segregate that is complicated, but freedom actually goes back to your first question, which is more difficult. But as I read Aquinas, the natural end of happiness is a necessary condition for freedom. It's not opposed to freedom. So when I said that happiness is the necessary condition for choice, I think that what that means for Aquinas is that without some vision of how your life ought to be going on the whole, there's no basis on which you to make a rational judgment between alternatives, okay? And a rational determination of a choice has to be some story about how the particular thing you're doing right now is related to your general conception of how to go on. And so I don't see freedom and I don't see a natural end and freedom as in any way opposed in Aquinas or Aristotle. So I think what Aquinas means by free will is that judgment.
I mean, I agree with your characterization that this that is sort of an ultimate end of the vision of perfection is a prerequisite, formally speaking. For,
Yes, formally.
For happiness and for agency. What I guess one often finds oneself struggling with, and what sort of brings out my Augustinian sympathies in me when I read or hear an account like this, is that there seems to be such an extraordinary divide between the formal account of action, deliberate action, towards happiness that we get in Aquinas, and the phenomenology in which, in fact, it tends to play itself out in life pretty much all the time.
Yeah.
So that's sort of...
Yeah, I'm not sure that I think there is such a divide, but I can't adequately take that on right now because I think I understand that there are two ways that you can make an argument about happiness. One is metaphysical, and that's the one that I've focused on, but you can also make it from within practical deliberation. Now, I think that in the treatise on happiness, actually, Aquinas makes the case more on the side of practical deliberation. And what's interesting about the treatise on happiness is that Boethius starts coming up all the time. Boethius, the consolation of philosophy, starts coming up. And that's really interesting for a lot of reasons, but of course, in the consolation of philosophy, Boethius is super depressed because here he has done what Plato taught, right? He sought justice, and he sacrificed some of the intellectual life for the good of the state, and the barbarian king is going to kill him, right? Because justice often comes into conflict with the will of those in power. And so now Boethius has this question, like, oh my gosh, I thought virtue was supposed to give me the good life and benefit me, but I'm going to get stoned to death, right? And for him, it's a very practical question. And when Lady Philosophy comes to Boethius, she's like trying to get him to see, like, what's really going to satisfy you. And the way that Aquinas argues, say, from question 3 to question 5, is more within that deliberative perspective. What's really going to satisfy you? And then he starts to sound Augustinian. It's all about restless hearts and stuff. But the Augustinian restless heart really just fits right there within his understanding of a rational capacity, right? As reaching out to the infinite, the true and the good, right? The true as the formal object of intellect, its end and measure, and the good as the formal object of will, as its end and measure. So I think that these two perspectives ultimately come together, but I have focused on one side of it.
One.
Thanks for your talk.
Yeah.
I have a question. I really love what you said at the end of your talk about happiness as a common good and friendship. But I wonder if there's any, it really seemed to me there could be a tension between that and your description earlier in the talk of the unified self. And I guess I wonder, to what extent does Aquinas require a subjective unified self, like a self that knows itself and has the capacity for deliberation? And to what extent can what we would call selfhood in a subjectivist age actually be distributed socially? And I guess you could comment on that. And what's underneath that question is always concern for how Thomistic claims affect those with intellectual disability or with people who, who for whatever reason can't have kind of perfect knowledge of the perfect end and reach out to seek it, and yet participate in the form of human life.
Right. Okay, so what was the first part of that again? So somehow so I understand the concern about the disabled.
So you have a beautiful account at the end of the talk, which I really love, about friendship.
Yeah, something about the unified self, yeah.
And so if happiness itself is social, this is Thomas would say it, but it's kind of socially constituted.
Yeah.
And intersubjectively constituted.
Yes, yes.
Then if happiness is intersubjectively constituted, then can practical agency itself be intersubjectively constituted, such that the burden of moral decision-making doesn't have to rest within the unified self that you described earlier?
Yes, okay, good. I think that Aquinas, like Aristotle, thinks that, we can't be happy without friends, and happiness is a common good, and so happiness is, in some sense, it's communion, and so I don't think that, Aquinas doesn't have he thinks that we're self-determined and that we rationally determine ourselves, but he doesn't give us a vision of the moral life in which it's about protecting or expressing your beautiful autonomy. So one of the things that the friend does for you is the friend helps you to be good. The virtuous friend, the good friend, the really meaningful friendships that are the stuff of happiness is that they help you to be good, right, when you are struggling or weak. And one of the reasons, so they do this because they love you, right, and because their good is bound up in your good. So if you're making disastrous life choices, it affects their own happiness because they love you. And so I think Aquinas is perfectly, he's perfectly happy with lots of joint deliberation. So counsel is a huge part. Counsel is when you seek, advice was a huge part of his vision of the moral life. So he doesn't think that somehow the best outcome is that you yourself autonomously decide. I mean, you have to make, ultimately, you have to choose. But that people would help you make good choices is not a problem for him. It's just part of, yeah. And for Aquinas, the polis should be helping you. So Aquinas also, like Aristotle, thinks that the prospects for being happy and virtuous are pretty dim if the laws are not ordered to human happiness. And so if you're in a society with a lot of unjust laws or a lot of laws that are really pretty actively opposed to human happiness, you're going to suffer. And so again, it's not, your happiness isn't just something that you can achieve by yourself. You have to be in the right environment and you have to have friends. Yeah.
Recognizing the hour, we'll end here, but Professor Frey, I'm sure will stick around for a few minutes if you have further questions and comments for her. Please join me in thanking her for this lecture.
I'm happy to.
You're happy?
I'm totally happy, but I'm also happy to take questions.